And here we are again, back for another installment of my Kindle adventures. Now, as you can see from the title, we're going to be going over some more classical-oriented books today. I believe this is the second video I've done similar to this. I've got my list written on my handy-dandy marker board over here, just so that I can keep track of all the ones that I have read, because I honestly forgot about a few of these. So the first one we're going to be reviewing today is I Am Legend. It's written by Richard Matheson. A lot of people know about this one because of the movie that Will Smith portrayed in. And I gotta say, from book to movie, there are some differences. The biggest one of which is going to be that in the movie, the monsters, if you will, were portrayed more so as zombies, even though they did have an issue with the sunlight. Whereas in the book, they were 100% vampires, and they knew they were vampires. They were sentient and to a degree able to communicate with words. So I consider it to be a pretty slow book in my personal opinion, but I did find it fascinating from a scientific standpoint. And it has a pretty interesting twist at the end in regards to just the vampires themselves and the society that they're going to create. But really and truly, the science is what kept me interested, just how they explained exactly how the anatomy of the vampire worked and how the germ that created them did its thing. Another thing I feel it's worth noting is we obviously know from the movie that a dog does die in the film, which I've never been a fan of in movies. Like a whole bunch of people could die in a movie and I wouldn't care about it, but they do anything to an animal, it's over, like it's on. But it didn't hit as hard in the book because it wasn't a dog that was special to the main character that the character previously knew before the outbreak. It was a random stray that he encountered. Like, the dog does still die, but it was a hopeless situation to begin with. And really and truly, the sad part about the interaction between the two of them was that the dog was the first living thing that he had seen in a very long time, and not the movie version where, there's a lot of sentimental love there, if that makes sense. But I'm going to move on from this one into our next one. It's Treasure Island. This book was written by Robert Louis Stevenson. I kind of lumped it into that whole classical category because it's a fairly old book. But my personal opinion, it was very difficult to get through. Like, it is a very slow book. Like, I've got a lot of notes written down here just to make sure I don't lose my track here. But there wasn't really, many things to note from this book. Like, honestly, the coolest thing that happened in this whole book was when the kid character stole a whole entire, pirate ship. But outside of that, like, it was very dry of a book. And I can just see people in the comments now coming after me because they probably really like this book. But it was just my personal opinion. So, take it for what it is. You might actually end up liking this book. I don't know. Hopping into our third book is going to be War of the Worlds by H.G. Wells. This one was a bit more fascinating. It was a bit slow in some parts, and a lot of people are going to be familiar with it because of the movie that Tom Cruise starred in. And I think there's been, a few other adaptations here and there that are a little bit more B-list, maybe even D-list in my personal opinion. But again, this is another one of those books that is mainly fascinating from a scientific standpoint. And if I'm not mistaken, because it's been a while since I've seen the movie, in the book, they make it a lot more obvious that the aliens came from Mars specifically, from, observation through telescopes and whatnot. Whereas in the movie, I don't think they really covered that, if I'm not mistaken. But the whole idea of it was the Martians, comparing their planet to ours, looked upon our planet with jealousy, and so they wanted our planet for themselves. So again, fascinating from a scientific standpoint, but also with the technology of the Martians themselves, and not just the stereotypical tripod machine that goes around killing people and abducting them. They overlaid details of like how they built the machines on Earth, and they didn't come pre-assembled, if that makes sense. And they just laid out this whole process on how the Martians plan to do everything. There's quite a bit of similarities between it and the movie as far as certain events that take place and people that you encounter. But all in all, it was not a bad read. Here we arrive to the fourth book in our list, Journey to the Center of the Earth. Now, honestly, I first encountered this story via the movie that came out some years ago. The fairly modernized movie, I should say. But there's, again, some similarities, and then there's some larger differences between the book and the film. Now, the book itself, honestly, I was not totally impressed with. And you might be looking at this video and I might be dumping on a lot of these older books, and you can say like, oh, you just didn't fully understand what the books were trying to do. It's from a different time period, whatever. That's not really what I'm getting into here. I'm just going from the standpoint of my own personal opinion as I'm reading them now. I'm trying to read them as if they were written back in that time, but I'm also reading them from today's standpoint as well. I try to look at it from both perspectives. But Journey to the Center of the Earth, written by Jules Verne, very well-known author. The issue that I take with this book is that it was very disappointing by the end. Now, you can skip a minute ahead because I'm going to spoil something real quick just for the purpose of this review. And it's the fact that they didn't actually make it to the center of the Earth. And they didn't follow 100% in the footsteps of the traveler that went before them that they were following. Now, end spoiler, like I said, just overall the book was disappointing and I felt like I wasted my time by the end of it. Now, a pro to consider for this book is, there again, the scientific side of it. The way they explained how a cavern or a center location of the Earth could exist in this science fiction way where you have actual living things from prehistoric times living, beneath the ground. That was fascinating. All the theories on what is actually at the center of the Earth. Is it a molten core or is it something else? And they explain how it could be something else than what today's modern science it currently explains it to be. They also go into great detail on how they navigate the tunnels and the caverns below and how they keep track of their progress with these instruments that they brought with them. Just how they track how deep and how far in a certain direction they've gone. And it was just quite interesting from that standpoint. A funny comparison that comes to mind is that it reminded me a lot of Around the World in 80 Days, where you have this professor type individual that nothing's going to stop him. He's going to achieve this goal. He's going to travel this distance no matter what. And then he has this little assistant that is just not about it the entire time. Like he hardly ever can find a good thing to say about their situation the majority of the time. And he's just kind of along for the ride, whether or not he's willing to be so. Hopping into our fifth book, it's going to be Fahrenheit 451. Now, I had some ulterior motives, if that's the right word to use, to read this book because I found the subject interesting. So the premise in the book is written by Ray Bradbury, and fun fact, it was originally called The Fireman. And he actually went through a whole bunch of different things, gathering research to write this book, and which is what ultimately led to the name change. The other fun fact is he allegedly called several different universities to try and find out the temperature in which book paper ignites and burns. No one at the universities could tell him until he made just one simple phone call to, I believe it was Los Angeles Fire Department, and spoke with one of the chiefs there at the time. And if I recall my research correctly, the chief basically said, "Hang on a second," and then came right back with the answer, just like that. And it ended up being Fahrenheit 451, so obviously that influenced the change for the book name. Now, there are some translations in other countries, from what I gather, that offer the Celsius conversion, which is like 231, I think. Probably not remembering that correctly, but you can look it up yourself. Anyways, so I actually had to look up some information on this book, in order to continue reading it after reading some chapters, because I was just not at all understanding some of the wordage that was being used. And it only made sense until after I did the research. The story itself takes place in the 24th century, from what I gather, but it didn't really establish that in the book itself. And the reason why I was so confused is that they were talking about the technology that they were utilizing. It only made sense once I realized the time period it was taking place in. And they were talking about TVs that encapsulate the entirety of the walls in a single room, I guess almost to make it an immersive experience, but they have robot dogs that inject you with like numbing agents to subdue you and all that. But the ultimate premise of the story is, in the past, firefighters, put out fires with water and whatnot. So what it would happen if they transitioned into the business of starting them instead of putting them out. What that means is basically you have this futuristic society where this governmental body has basically taken over and subjugated the citizens. And they utilize the firemen as a way of doing that. So basically what they do when they respond out on a call, they're not going to put out a fire. They're responding to a call where somebody has reported somebody owning or reading what would be considered banned reading material by the government. So books that we love today that inspire free thinking, things like that, would be banned reading. So there's only certain books that are approved reading by the government. So if you're caught in possession of any of the banned books, then all of them get burned along with your entire property and you get carted off to jail. What's interesting about this book is that it takes what I would call a bit of a Hunger Games book series approach. So it starts off with this character who is a fireman and he's going along, going through the motions of what the government is basically having him do. He plays his part to perfection until a catalytic moment, if you will, that causes him to start thinking and changing his mind. The reason why I say it takes a Hunger Games approach is that it starts off as this one storyline, but then it eventually turns into this change of mindset and this ultimate goal of eventually moving against and overthrowing this governmental power that is controlling everybody. And so that part was fascinating to me. And as far as the ways that ultimately him and this group of people that he eventually links up with go about trying to preserve the old reading materials that are considered banned. I'm going to make a comparison to the Book of Eli movie. It takes a bit of an approach like that, which is quite interesting to say the least, as far as how they're preserving materials. But all in all, not a bad read. Bit slow, but I think ultimately worth it in the end. Which leads me into the next to last book in our list here. Or two books, technically, is the Iliad and the Odyssey, written by Homer. So I got to be perfectly honest with this one. I was excited for it until I started reading it, and I literally just could not get through it. And it might have been the way it was worded, but I get where this little duo of books has its place in history and whatnot. Like, I'm not discrediting whatever worth it has. Just not really my cup of tea. And I'm someone who's always been interested in like the Greek and Roman mythology, stuff like that, and just general world history. So I've already read through all of the mythological stories that you can think of and have a large amount of interest in those things. And I even read like the summarized versions of the Iliad and Odyssey that they make you go through in school. But I very quickly found out why they're summarized. I felt like the narrator, or whoever the book was about, spent more time summarizing, talking to somebody else in this scene about the more interesting parts of his journey versus the actual part of the journey that he's in where the book is taking place, which is the first one, I think, is the Iliad and takes place during the Trojan War and kind of goes through a lot of that, whereas I think the Odyssey takes place some years after the Trojan War, and there again, it just did not click with me, and there's really not a whole lot that I can say about it. Like, it definitely skimmed over a lot of the more mythological parts of the story, and went even slower through the drier parts of the story. You can say in the comments if I'm misrepresenting the book, that's fine. If you want to put your own representation of the book in the comments, just so I'm not misleading anybody on anything, then feel free, go right ahead. It's just my personal opinion. I didn't find it that stimulating or interesting. But that's all I'm going to say on that one. I'm sure there's some people out there that find it a very interesting book and find a lot of value in it, but I'm just not one of those people personally. So now, I am going to hop into the final book of this review. Now, I don't really consider this one old enough to be a classic, but I wasn't sure what else or what other type of book review video I could place it in, because I'm not 100% sure if I'm going to continue the series or not. So I'm going to do a little standalone review at the end of this video with this one. So the book I'm talking about is The Housemaid by Frida McFadden. Now, full disclosure, I actually listened to most of the book when I went on a trip with my parents. They started getting into listening to audiobooks, and this happened to be one of the ones they were reading on one of the drives. I've also, through them, gotten to listen to a couple of other Frida McFadden books, and I've noticed some similarities across the 3 or 4 that I've heard and read, but this one was interesting enough for me to purchase it on the Kindle and finish reading it. It's an interesting book, to say the least. Now, it's probably going to sound terrible when I say this, but I really don't mean anything by it. It's interesting from the standpoint, I think you get a real sense of being inside the mind of a woman and how a woman would perceive certain situations. And that's not to say that it would be any different from how a man would perceive certain things, but it's the way things are written and worded. You kind of get, it has its own identity, if you will. Yeah, I hope that's a proper way to say that, because I really don't mean anything negative by it. All in all, an interesting book, and has a really fun twist towards the end, though by the time it gets right before the twist, you kind of see it coming. It was pretty obvious. I got to where I could predict certain things in the book. But what I will say for the Frida McFadden books is that she has this unbeaten skill to create some of the most annoying characters I've ever encountered in my life that you just want to strangle because of how things are worded. And it also might be the way the voice actor for the audiobook portrays them as well, because I'm pretty sure it's the same voice actor for all of the audiobooks. And just the way she portrays certain characters that you just love to hate, it will just about drive you crazy every time they enter the scene. But at the very end, I thought it was a pretty solid book, especially the ending where certain things come to light and when things just kind of come together in the end. I found it quite interesting. I don't know, you can definitely tell it has been written by the same person, if that makes sense. The book itself left at the end some openings for her to continue, which I'm pretty sure she did, because there's 2 other books that go by the name of The Housemaid, just with certain changes. There again, I'm not sure if I'm going to pursue reading the rest of the series, but if I do, there'll be a whole other review video for that shortly. But at the very least, at least the main character of this book wasn't a complete and total idiot and actually made some really intelligent decisions when dealing with certain hostile individuals. I'm just going to say that. Like, she was actually very smart about the situation that she was placed in. And I really appreciated that. It's something different because people in, horror or suspense, thriller type situations historically always make the dumbest decisions when they're faced with the worst things imaginable. But this character, super impressed with. Very intelligent. A definite survivor, to say the least. But all in all, that's all the books that I have for this review here. Hope you guys enjoyed. And, you really should consider reading some of these just from a historical standpoint and appreciation for the classics, if nothing else. You might end up liking some of the ones that I didn't much care for. So since finishing these books, I've actually hopped into some books that have some current popularity, and I think they're going to be quite interesting reads. So I've actually just started reading Dune, and after I finish Dune, I'm going to hop into the Maze Runner sequel trilogy, which is the Maze Runner, the Godhead Complex, and I think he just came out with a new one called The Infinite Glade. So really interested to see the direction that those books take. Like I said, hope you guys enjoyed this video, and I'll catch you guys in the next one. See you next time.